Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of RadialSpark Radio. I'm Justin Ludlow. Mike still hasn't learned his lesson and left me unsupervised again. See, this is what I'm talking about, guys. With me, I've got George Heckard. You guys might remember him from my last Celigo broadcast. And as always, in the background, we got Peyton, if you want to say a quick hello.
Yo, yo.
Hey, thanks, Peyton. So today, I guess the fair thing to say is we're going to do a little bit of cleanup from our last Celigo one. We kind of jumped into something very specific. We were talking about these V2 to IA migrations, and we've got a lot of customers that work with Celigo that are familiar with the tool and use it. But we also have, I think, a fair number of customers who aren't. And so for the uninitiated, we were like, maybe let's walk this back a few steps and talk about what Celigo is, what is their main product, like what were some of these buzzwords we were using in the previous broadcast, and just talk about it in a general sense. George, as the guy that I'm regularly putting in charge of my Celigo things, is there anything you want to add to that before we start to dive in?
No, I think you're right. We kind of put the cart before the horse a little bit, but it was information that was super relevant because we had just had the I think it was a town hall where they had come out and they had done a lot of discussion about like AI and things like that. And so we were very excited about what they talked about because it was worth talking about. And now we're kind of like, well, but what if folks are, just kind of dipping their toes into the deep Celigo pond? We should talk a little bit about what that means and get them spooled up on all the fun stuff that Celigo can do.
Excellent. And so for those of you tuning in, I guess we do have a bit of a surprise this time. For once, we're not going to be presenting an article or plugging something that I wrote a couple days ago. We're actually going to do a bit of a screen share and actually show some of what's in the tool in our own environment. It'll be pretty high level, pretty surface level stuff just to get you guys kind of initiated in understanding it. But again, Mike let me run free with no regulation. So we're going to do what I want this time. Before we get into that, though, I think it might make sense to just talk very briefly and at a high level about what Celigo is, or like what is the business problem they aim to solve. And so before I pull you in, George, for everybody listening, I guess let me start by saying in its simplest form, and this may be overly reductive, Celigo is a company specializing in ETL integration tools. And for those of you that don't know ETL, spend more time on the internet, but that means extract, transform, and load, because that's what you're doing with your data. Extracting it from one system, transforming it into whatever shape you need in the next system, and then loading it in there. And so their whole business model is around delivering on that need. And they kind of have, I guess, at this stage in the game, two flavors on this. They have their Integrator IO platform, which is the actual product. That is what Celigo sells. Celigo is not the name of the product. It's the name of the company. And then they also now have what they call integration applications, which have gone through several evolutions over time. But these are kind of the two big flavors on how they deliver these. Before I'm about to pull you in here, George, but I guess the one thing maybe I should call out with these two flavors is integration applications, or IAs, as you're going to hear us refer to them a lot on this call. They are actually built on Integrator IO or deployed on it. So they use that first flavor, that main product, the platform, but they have a couple extra things like they're more pre-built. We're going to get into that. But I guess with that foundation laid, George, is there something you'd add, or how would you go about explaining like what Integrator IO in general is?
Yeah. So one of the things that I like to do when talking about any of the systems that we work in is, and I don't want to say it like to be condescending or anything, but I like to dumb things down a little bit. I'm very much the type of person that's like, if you can't explain what something is very technically and take that and distill it down to like easy to digest words and like put it in a way that people can understand, then you don't really understand what you're talking about. And so what I like to do is I like to make sure that I kind of articulate that, complex idea as something easy to digest. So basically, what Celigo allows you to do is it allows you to take one system and pull or push data out of that system and pull or push it into another system. So it's basically just transferring data between two different systems and working as the middleman.
I like that. And I actually I like the way you said it, how we can pull or push data out of the system. And that was actually like one of those things that I did want to make sure we touched on here. Now, I don't want to spoil our own agenda because I do get excited about the technology and I'll jump like 12 pages ahead. So maybe I think at this point, it would actually be kind of cool as we talk about some high level concepts. Could we pivot over to that screen share and just bring up the home page for like RadialSpark Celigo instance, like with all the tiles and everything on it. And let's start talking about the concepts with that in the background. Peyton's gonna do a little maneuvering, guys. So give us just a second to get set up.
And let's not judge the names of these tiles either.
Oh no, this is just for example and demonstration. Don't worry about it.
Okay. I was like, there's nothing we need to be worried about, but it's definitely a test environment.
Test.
That's right.
I just means we have a test environment.
Yes, exactly. So this is our sort of playground here that we have. There's a ton of different Celigo instances that we have access to, but this is ours right here for when we need to test something or try and set something up. It's very limited because we don't have connections to like NetSuite, but it's good for us to have something visual to go along with what we're talking about as we discuss like what the actual custom flows can do.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And so before we go beyond this screen, this is kind of where I wanted to take us so that people could look at this and maybe start to visualize.
Yeah.
So this is our RadialSpark production environment. And I'm going to call that out because Integrator IO supports having a sandbox environment and a production environment. And now, as I know this, it's a little bit different than what people like from the Salesforce ecosystem might think of as a sandbox, because a sandbox represents an individual org. Whereas in the case of Celigo, what it really is you have your production instance that can have multiple integrations, or as we, casually call them tiles, and now everybody listening along can see tiles on the screen. This is why. So your production environment can have multiple tiles for the different things you're integrating in production. But then it's almost like a toggle switch where you flip over to a sandbox mode, again, multiple tiles. And so it's not necessarily quote unquote multiple sandboxes, but it's just drawing a line between I'm using this for production, real data, like sensitive stuff, versus this is work in progress, or this is a test or an experiment.
Yeah, it's less of like a bona fide. There's not a whole lot of difference between the Celigo sandbox and the Celigo production. It's literally just a partition to help you organize when you're creating these connections and these integrations, which ones are connected to your sandboxes and which ones are connected to your production.
I like that. I like the idea of sandboxing as like a partitioning mechanic.
Yeah.
So, now, with that said, I think there's a few things that we can then touch on, right? So there's tiles. Tiles, or integrations, as Celigo formally calls them, this is technically a grouping of flows. So this is not like a single, I'm moving very specific data from A to B. It's multiple things, but they are related to each other, and they're specifically related by what Celigo calls connections. And these would be the systems that you're integrating between. So you might have a tile that connects your Salesforce sandbox and your NetSuite sandbox, and that tile can have multiple flows, which are like specific integrations happening between those two systems, but they're all reusing the same connections. They're all interacting between the same source systems.
Yep.
Excellent.
Yeah. So, and I think that's a good way of putting it. If you think of the migration or the integration itself as a bundle of flows, so that's the integration, right? You're saying we're taking these specific data points and transferring them from one system to another using the flows. So the flows are the actual direct pipelines, but the migration itself is the collection, right? The compilation of those different flows.
I like that.
Yeah.
So with that said, I would now like to click into like this test flow. And I know this is an empty placeholder test flow, but just so people can get an idea of this next level of concept that we're going to talk about here.
Yeah, sure. So within every integration, this is and just from a high level, this is where people will start. You up here, you've got a couple of different tabs that you can click into. We're not going to click into that stuff because that's more of like once we're actually on a project, we'll go ahead and show you what this is. But when you click into there, and there can be a list of flows. I've seen integrations that have like 60 flows. Rare. It's more like 2 or 3, but it is worth calling that out that like you can have a ton of flows.
Extensive flows. Yeah.
So let me click in here. So this is what it looks like when you actually start to build your flow. One of the things that I really like about Celigo is that it does kind of make it user friendly, right? Like people who don't necessarily need to be super tech savvy. It's a lot of point and click work. And that's one thing that I really like about it.
Actually, I really appreciate you bringing that up because that was something I wanted to touch on and completely spaced in all my excitement about some of the stuff we're about to talk about. Why would anybody care about Celigo for a second? I think it's entirely worth mentioning how powerful this tool is because it's a point and click integration. You're setting up your connections to the systems. I'm gonna use Salesforce as an example because I'm a big Salesforce guy. So your integration to Salesforce, your connection to Salesforce, that's just done through a Salesforce user. You're like, hey, I'm going to use this user to access the API for this instance. Here's the credentials. Here's the setup. In Salesforce, you have all their permissions, profiles, all of that set up to give them access to what you need for the integration. And that's it. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And you configure all that through point and click UI, either the Salesforce administrative setup UI or in Celigo, getting it all wired together. And then you get into a flow and you have a very visual design experience like this, where you're clicking your way through an integration. And I think that's something worth mentioning because by and large, I feel like most people these days look at integrations in one of two ways. It's either a very code heavy endeavor. Like if you're a big business, you got complicated systems, you're tying stuff together. You're doing a lot of programming. You're writing a lot of code to tie your systems together. Whereas in the other end of the spectrum, which might be you're a really small business and you can't afford developers and you can't afford a very fancy or expensive tool, you might be looking at something that's more of a if this then that type integration. And that's where stuff like IFTTT comes in. That's where like the Zapiers of the world come in and people buy those integrations. Celigo is, I think, like a step up in terms of power, complexity, and maturity over that, while maintaining that point and click accessibility. Because the things with like Zapier's, all of those pieces is it's tied to very specific hooks. Like you need an if this. Something happens and that triggers the integration. These Celigo integrations, whether you're set up real time, pushing data in, or whether you are scheduling them, this is truly a data level integration. We're not talking about, a data, like a business process happened, something happened, a button was pushed. It's we can check for changes in data in either system, get that data when it changes, and pass it along just for the purpose of keeping two systems aligned.
Well, and just to add to that a little bit too, I think it adds a complexity. Like I don't know much about Zapier, but I also know that with Celigo, like you can tailor it to very specific scenarios, right? You can say, okay, if this opportunity meets this criteria and this criteria, but the account also has this done, then we can push that to sync. It allows you a lot more
Very, very
flexibility.
precise.
Yes, exactly.
I like that. So then I'd like to take a moment to actually overview, I guess, a couple of the key concepts that we're now going to see on the screen here. We've talked about the connections being like the actual credentials or logins for the systems you're connecting to, and that's what enables you to push or pull the data from them. But then in a flow itself, we can see we've got a tile here on the left for add source, and then on the right, we've got add destination or lookup, and we've also got some plus symbols and some stuff in between. So I figure we'll take it left to right, right? The source for a flow is the source of your data. Like, and to bring this to a common example, CRM and ERP, Salesforce and NetSuite. You have an opportunity that gets closed won in Salesforce, and you want to hand that off to NetSuite to become a sales order, something like that, so that your fulfillment team in NetSuite can then act on it, do their job, like actually ship your widgets, whatever it may be. So in a use case like that, Salesforce would be your source, because you're saying, hey, the origin of this data that I need to integrate, it's going to be a Salesforce opportunity. So I'm setting up my source, and in this source tile or step, this is where you can say, like, I only want things that meet these very particular criteria. And it could be on like a scheduled flow, which is a recurring flow happening on an interval, that we're querying Salesforce through this connection and saying, hey, every 30 minutes, I'm going to ask you what's been updated in the last 30 minutes that also meets this extra criteria. And then I need to do some stuff.
Yep.
In a push, which is more of a real-time flow, the source could actually be like a webhook with Salesforce, where you're going into like an Apex trigger and you're adding a little bit of code that's like, hey, when data is changed, push this out to Celigo so that it can operate on it. So you're connecting to the same system, potentially to access the same kind of data, but we have some options for how we connect it based on how real time you need it to be. Does it matter if you are pulling it from Salesforce, hitting their API? Do you want to push it out from Salesforce? For those of you who have heard me talk about inbound governor limits, you probably know that I would have some personal thoughts on that. But so this is basically where you pull your data from. And it could be an API request to get the data out, or it could be a webhook waiting for an API request to push the data in.
Right. Yep.
So then from there, we then start passing off to what Celigo's calling like destinations or lookups. And so this is like where we want to potentially send the data to. And maybe before we talk about destinations, let's touch on what a lookup is for a second, right? This is effectively, you got some data from your source system, and then maybe you want to get auxiliary or complementary data from another system to tack on to the original data you had to help complete the picture before then saving that into a third system.
Right. A good example of that is like employees in NetSuite. So a lot of times when we import customers, like you go from an account in Salesforce to a customer in NetSuite, and we need like the sales rep, right? Or something to that effect. So we would use a lookup to pull those additional employee records in. And again, you can use that. You can use a criteria like a filter on that employee lookup to say, only pull the employee that has a specific ID or a specific email, that sort of thing. And that'll pull it right into the flow. So you can then pull that into the record that gets created in NetSuite later on.
Basically saving your customer and the employees under that customer that you care about.
That's right.
I like that. Thank you. That was a really good explanation, George. So with that said, that's giving us several options to like start from a kernel of data and then build on that kernel with additional supporting data before delivering it to somewhere. So then when we get into a destination, this is where we're actually saying like, hey, I've got my big pile of data that I want saved somewhere. This is where I want it saved. Time to shove it in. And this is, it could be like, it could be a file send, but almost always, I think this is an API request, like more often than not. We're making an API request and we're sending the data. It could be in bulk. It could be one record at a time, depending on the scale you're working at. But we see a lot of the same things. And unfortunately, with an empty flow, I don't know that we have the ability to show it. But one of the things that's really cool about both sources and destinations and how they're handled here is the fact that you can set up a mapping to basically say, you get this data and this is what I want you to name it coming out of the source. And then going into a destination, you can say, hey, in Celigo, I've called it this, but it corresponds to this field in the destination or this property, so that you know that everything maps in. And that's a big part of like having a very powerful point and click approach to integration, is knowing that, you know, even the same field, if it's the exact same data type, if you've lined everything up to the best of your ability, the actual names of the fields might be a little different. Things like, you're going to need to draw lines between your source data and what you want it to look like in your destination, and be like, this becomes this, this becomes this becomes that.
Yeah. And I was going to say, and it's tough because like literally we do, you know, at RadialSpark, we do projects where we will stand up these flows from start to finish, and it can, you know, we do many meetings with clients to sit down and show them how this all works. So it's tough to like try to avoid getting too far into the weeds on a, you know, a 30-minute webcast here, but like, you know, there's so much we can talk about, and it's tough for me not to be like, well, and you can do transformations and you can do, you know, and just
and I was gonna say, and I'm trying to keep an eye on the clock so that Mike doesn't get too mad at me here. Maybe if we back it up, would you mind clicking on that plus symbol back on the main flow? And could we take a look at like some of what they will, the one in between source and destination, I believe, has what we're looking for. So you can add branching logic. And I guess because we don't have a step in here, they won't show it. But Celigo does have transformations. And these are things that can happen like right after any step in your process. So I think a good example, I'm going to go back to Salesforce, is like if you're pushing data into Celigo through a webhook, you know, Apex Trigger sends data, it sends every field on the record. They're like, hey, we're going to give you everything because we don't know what you need. And that may be a cumbersome amount of data, like especially if you're dealing with a customer that's got like 500 fields on opportunity.
Yeah.
Not that anybody's ever seen that before.
Which we've seen. Yep.
Yeah. So to then be able to say like, hey, I actually only care about these 10 fields, and here's what I'd like them to be called for the rest of the flow. And it basically trims it down and reshapes the structure of the data to whatever you set in that transformation. And so for the rest of the flow, it's called that way. And then it's even more powerful because like when you have a lookup or something like that, or if like, let's say you're inserting an opportunity as a sales order in the NetSuite, and then you want to write that sales order ID back, you can have a transformation either after the lookup step or after the insert step for the sales order that's like, oh, give me that ID that came back from the response, and then attach it back to the original opportunity. And then I'm going to write back to the Salesforce org and update that ID so that I'm related.
And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here because I know we're going to talk about the IA in a little bit, but I think it's important to mention, you know, maybe something we talk about is the IA can be very useful for folks who just want like a pre-built thing and they can go and, you know, they don't need to do all this configuration hoobie-doobie. That's the technical term.
It is the technical term, guys. Hoobie-doobie.
We use that every day. But there are some constraints with that, right? So like, I think that's a good call out to have that, like, this is, you know, the custom flows are exactly what they sound like. They're custom. Whatever you need to do, more or less, these flows can handle them. The IA are very specifically built flows to meet specific use cases.
And I was going to say, the last thing I wanted to touch on for the custom flows, and this kind of ties into transformations, is there's all this power that all this stuff can be done in point and click. But then additionally, you have the ability as part of transformations or other pieces to tie in scripts where you can actually write JavaScript in Celigo that in a certain stage in the flow, you can take your data and then programmatically alter it. So if you need to go really deep and do some really crazy stuff with your data, which is usually when I get pulled in to help with these projects. And somebody's like, hey, we gotta reshape this whole thing. How do we handle it? And I'll write like 25 lines of code. And to be clear, like I didn't make that number up. I literally just solved a pretty big mapping problem last week with 25 lines of code that just reshape some data and make the rest of the flow a lot easier.
Yeah, and the other thing, so two points real quick. So number one is, if you have someone who's like code savvy like that, like we got Brad, and anytime I pull Brad in, Brad can knock stuff out very quickly by just writing a few lines of code. He almost prefers it. But the second piece too is one thing that I want to talk about real quick is, with these custom flows, you're not limited to which objects you can write to in one flow. So we have like several clients right now who are doing like, okay, we need to import in one flow the customer, a sales order, and an invoice or something to that effect, right? And so like, I think it's really interesting that if you have all your ducks in a row for what you need to have happen in one single sync, you can make it happen with these custom flows where you're just saying bang, 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 bang. Now I have records. Exactly. So worth mentioning, but that's all I've got on that. So if you want to,
I was going to say, well, let's take a moment to talk about integration applications, what IAs are, because we are about to hit time, and I'm totally going to get in trouble with Mike and probably you guys for holding you hostage. So
do you want me to stop presenting this? Because this isn't the
I was
IA.
going to say, I think we'll be good to stop presenting this. We're gonna shuffle our layout right back. So give us a second, guys.
All right. Are y'all hoobie doobied? All right,
perfect. Cool. Hoobie doobied. So we've talked in very general terms about like what Celigo is. It's a point and click integration platform. It's got the ability to make very complex integrations between multiple systems that, as you said, they could be multi-step. And you can also divide those integrations into like pipes or flows so that it's like, I've got 7 different pipelines that connect data between these systems, and these pipelines can each do a multitude of things to make sure my business process happens the way I want it to. And it does it all in a point and click approach, which I think is really cool. So let's say that's still too hard for me. I want something easier. In comes the integration app. Tell me about integration apps, George.
Okay, so I want to tread lightly here because I think that there's some misconceptions about how easy, like I'm going to say these are super easy, but like, let's also be clear that they do take configuration. It's not just a flip the switch and it's ready to go sort of thing, which we get a lot of folks who are like, they said that we could do this super easy. And I'm like, it is easy. It just takes
a little more time.
Don't get me started. So the integration applications, let's start with what systems they can talk to. I don't want to say limitless, but we have a ton of different options in which orgs we can use. I think there's AWS through Amazon. We can do stuff with Walmart's API that they have that's built to them. And our main focus, a lot here that we see a lot is NetSuite and Salesforce. But basically what an integration application is it's a pre-built set of custom flows. So Celigo sat down and they said, hey, we got a lot of folks who are buying our product, but a lot of them are asking for the same thing. So why don't we just package that and sell that as a separate product so that it's pre-built, there's fewer steps involved and it's a little bit more intuitive, right? Just to say like, we're going to go in, we're going to flip the switch, we're going to modify the mappings, and we're done. Run some tests, that sort of thing. And they included things like a test mode and like some error management stuff. So what I like about it is it gives you options, but it's very like it's for the average person, right? It's for the I think on our last webinar I made the joke that like, oh, we have to do this thing and it has to get built and blah 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 blah. And I'm an accountant. You know what I mean? So like a lot of times we see that person who doesn't have a degree or doesn't have training in technical stuff like Celigo getting assigned to these. And so I think that the integration application is kind of geared towards that level of understanding where you don't have to be code savvy. You don't have to have a ton of experience in these systems. It's relatively basic to set up. There are steps involved. It definitely does take time. I think one of the biggest things, that we see people kind of say like, well, why is this taking longer, is because like there's differences between their two systems, right? So they'll have like
always mapping.
It's always the mapping, and it's always subsidiaries. Like those are my two big ones.
I hope we don't get in trouble with Oracle for bashing subsidiaries.
Yeah, I'm not bashing subsidiaries. They're
fun to integrate for.
Yeah, they're fun. We've had some experiences with them, but basically my thing is like, if someone is considering buying custom flows, that may not be the right tool for the job. If they're trying to do something like account to customer or contact to contact, like that's something that the IA can handle, and it comes pre-built. So you are more restricted on what you can do with it. But if you're not looking to do anything crazy, we've had clients come in and they're like, we want one flow, we've got 5 mappings, and we already have all our stuff put together, so we just need to set it up. And we're like, all right, cool. And we do it. And it takes no time at all. And then they're like, we need to test this. We're like, go for it. They test it, and then we go live. And it's like, awesome.
And
why can't we have 50 of you guys? Like,
I wanted to ask this. So there is, I guess, like a bit of a trade-off with the IA, right? Like it's pre-built, it's quick to implement, kind of quick to go live, but it is an on the rails experience, right? So so they're pre-built custom flows effectively, and I think it's important to acknowledge like it's on the integrator IO platform, and so an IA shows up as a tile with all your other integrations, but when you click into that, you get a very similar but not exactly the same experience, because all of the flows already exist. You can't add new flows that are completely custom to it.
Right.
And you don't actually get that same, like when you click into the flow, changing every little detail of it. It is a little bit on the rails.
So yeah, and that was what I wanted to, I brought up earlier too, was the difference between what you can do in the IA versus the IO. The IA is relatively, it's pre-built, but there's things you can go in and change. You can set new criteria filters. You can tell it when you want to export, are we doing deltas? Are we doing all data? You can modify connections, that sort of thing. What you can't do is like add another lookup in the flow. You can't add like, oh, we're going to do, because the thing that they wanted to avoid, right, is people buying like, the IA and being like, well, we're just going to add this into this flow and this into this flow and just build it out into this monstrosity that does all of their use cases. So, you can't add necessarily like more nodes into the opportunity to sales order flow, which it honestly is kind of a good thing, because if that's not what you want,
well, I mean, it keeps it simple too, right? Because if the whole point is to make it more accessible, and then you're like, oh, but by the way, you can totally shoot yourself.
By the way, where's your webhook? Like,
yeah.
So it definitely has its place, and I think that on average, it is more in tune with what clients,
like the average business user.
Yeah. And we've had really large clients come to us and be like, well, we don't know how to integrate Salesforce and NetSuite. And we're like, Celigo's great. And they're like, cool, will you set it up? We're like, yeah. And then we do. And they're like, wow, that was super easy. And we're like, yeah, that's kind of the point.
Yeah. Trying to keep it fast, simple, and hopefully cheap.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, hey, I know we have run a few minutes over. I'm trying not to abuse everybody here and not get in trouble with Mike for completely like blowing through like time management targets.
Yeah.
We've covered just about everything I wanted to for an initial overview on like what Celigo is, what is Integrator IO, what is an integration application. Was there anything that you wanted to tack on here at the end before we close out? I'll give you a final chance to chime in.
No, I think that we've covered a lot. My issue is that like we have done just a drop in the bucket. You know what I mean? Of
Oh,
what
yeah.
the integration can do, and also it's a little challenging to talk about something without being able to show it. Like I'm a very visual person, and we can't really
Oh,
show a whole lot.
don't worry. We'll do a whole series on these, and I will let you prepare a whole bunch of things for them. So get excited about that, bud.
Well, but for today, we'll keep it short and sweet.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. Well, then, with that said, guys, really appreciate you all tuning in. For anybody that we lost in the weeds on that last Celigo broadcast where we just kind of went a million miles an hour and shot into it, hopefully this gives you a little more sense of bearings as to what this tool is, what it can do. If you're interested, if you're curious about it, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at engage@radialspark.com. Any of our contact information included with the broadcast. We're always happy to answer questions, always happy to help. But thank you guys for listening. Hope this was informative for you and excited to catch you again later. Take care, everyone.